To refresh our memory of Benetton and give us deeper insight into the foundation, let's watch this short clip to mark the beginning of this conference. Thank you.
Tradition helps us understand the present. It is a wisdom that uncovers our basic nature. Master sculptor and painter Berne Convention returns to the rituals of his youth and visualizes their hidden spirituality. In the process, he discovers his own essence.
Well, my art began when my father was carving in the shrine at Onitsha in the village. And he did lots of images, traditional images, which were then regarded as, you call them gods. And the effects it had on me was one of fear, because I used to be afraid of them. But when my father died, before I grew into boyhood, I began to look at things and to try to make my own images. I began to draw on the sand. After each rain, it more or less was a slate, a clean slate. Then I drew with a broomstick. Broomstick was my first pencil, and the sand was my paper. I went to my home to Onitsha, and because we have ceremonies, traditional ceremonies, funeral ceremonies, I just began to use some of the traditional dances.
In Nigeria, masquerades are village ceremonies that make use of dance, costume, and music to invoke spirits, the honorable dead. The masquerade acts out religious beliefs. Over all hovers the supernatural.
A dance movement must have a mask associated with it. But the mask itself was not the whole thing. In fact, the dancer and the movement he made were the whole thing. The mask was only a feature signifying his personality, or the personality of the goddess or god or goddess that he represented. I now consider it a very important period in my work. It's taking me back to my roots with my father.
One of the things I remember he said to people who doesn't appreciate art was, if you haven't heard of Ben, then you haven't been to school.
You can never bring up a discussion about visual art and never mention the name Benetton.
He lived for art, he dreamt art, he loved nature. My husband found beauty in things that don't count importance. I am Caroline. My native name is Obiageli. I'm married to Professor Berne Convention, and we have 4 children, and one of them is Oliver.
I'm Oliver Wong, and I'm Executive Director of the Benetton Foundation. I would say that no other Nigerian artist before him has been entrenched in our national consciousness.
The Benetton Foundation was established in the year 2003 to preserve the Benetton's legacy. Wong is the most influential artistic figure of the 20th century and has been hailed since the 1950s as Africa's greatest artist. In 1957, he was commissioned to sculpt the bronze portrait of a ruling monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, and the sitting began at Buckingham Palace. Also, he was the first federal art advisor to the government. Other famous works of his include Ayawu, or The Awakening, which today stands at the United Nations headquarters. So what made Berne Wong's art an object of interest? It's often mentioned that his visual language fused Western techniques and indigenous traditions together to create what is now known as African modernist art. He interpreted modern aesthetics while paying allegiance to his culture. One important symbol that recurs in his work is womanhood.
He feels women are beautiful.
And for him, the woman is a symbol of nationhood. The foundation is established in honor of Berne Wong, and as much as possible, we try to project his values, and that's why the foundation deems it fit to preserve his legacy for generations yet unborn, to imitate, to copy, to emulate, and to continue his path.
One of the ways the foundation hopes to achieve this is through continuing artists' professional development and empowerment. And the foundation counts this necessary because a lot of Nigerian artists never know much beyond the rudiments of arts.
Because a lot of Nigerian artists, when they go through school, they're only taught the rudiments of art. How to paint, perspective, anatomy. But they're not taught how to sustain themselves outside the four walls of the school. How is it in the business world, for instance?
The Berne Wong Foundation has taken it upon itself to ensure that it is able to empower artists when it comes to business. The foundation is located in the artist's home, which lends to its cultural and historical significance. Within the premises, there's the Omenka Gallery. Omenka Gallery is a leading gallery in Lagos, and indeed Nigeria, and it represents a diverse number of artists working in different media.
Some of our artists we have showcased on the international scene, where we've participated in major art fairs all over the world on about 5 continents. We also have an active publications program where we produce critical text to accompany their work as a way of exposing them to new and international audiences while encouraging research into their work. A lot of people think art is purely decorative, but I say no, and the foundation says no. One of the things the foundation is trying to do is to ensure we change our perception through programs like our Distinguished Lecture Series, where we have people from all walks of life come to speak about the changing role of art in society.
They have also had scholarship schemes for students of Ahmadu Bello University, Yaba College of Technology, and of course, University of Ife, now Obafemi Awolowo University.
For instance, one of the major topics today, on the contemporary art scene is artists' resale rights. While musicians and authors benefit from secondary sales of their works and their royalties, Nigerian visual artists do not. And that's why there's so much global attention right now on African art. And I think that's a major subject that the Berne Wong Foundation and of course the French Cultural Center, Alliance Française, and we're looking into to see how we can change enabling laws in order to ensure that artists benefit from copyright sales. There will be enabling structures in place, to ensure that even funds and grants, are used to support Nigerian artists. I think that things will grow, and the sector will be sustained.
To continue with the program, I would like to invite our first speaker, who is the founder and executive director of the Benetton Foundation, as well as the president of the Society of Nigerian Artists. He is also the founder of Omenka Gallery and Omenka Magazine. This respectable speaker sits on the board of several organizations, including the Reproduction Rights Society of Nigeria, the Lagos Biennial, and the National Gallery of Arts, Nigeria. In addition, he is a member of the Advisory Group of Technology and Creativity in the Nigeria Industrial Policy and Competitiveness Advisory Council, chaired by His Excellency, the Vice President of Nigeria. Please join me to welcome Mr. Oliver Enwonwu as he comes to speak on the significance of resale rights for Nigerian artists.
Thank you, Uino. Well, you'll think that after that introduction I'll have so much to say, but I'm a bit in combative mode because it's a topic that is extremely dear to my heart, being an artist and the son of an artist as well. Well, before I do that, let me just recognize a few important people here. There's Professor Bruce Onobekpaya. Round of applause for him, please. There's also Professor Ebon Clark. Pa Jerome Eliho is here as well. And there's also a past president of Society of Nigerian Artists, a veteran artist, Mr. Kolade Oshinowo. And there's so many other people here, Professor Franco Gilmore, Oluwamoda, so many people here. Thank you for all coming. Well, I'll just go straight down to business. And we're here to talk about the artist's resale right in Nigeria. Well, the artist's resale right just has to do with the artist gaining from his copyright, his intellectual property. And that's very important because other creatives do that. Other creatives gain from their intellectual property rights. Musicians, authors, many years after they've passed on, they still gain. But the artist is a bit different, especially in Africa and Nigeria, where the artist doesn't gain anything from his copyright, especially when he sold his work, first of all, from his studio, and then later on, maybe at an auction or a gallery or a middle person sells his work, he doesn't gain anything. And that's very dangerous in the sense that, you know, the artist sells cheaper at the start, and with the growth of his career, you know, many years on, after he's appreciated in value, you know, the collector makes much money from the sale of his art without the artist gaining anything. So the artist's resale right seeks to correct this anomaly by assuring that artists receive a small percentage of the real sale price of their works. And this is why we're here today. We have a distinguished panel comprising of leading legal experts, and they're going to be talking later, so I leave a lot of that to them. But there's no better place than to start at Alliance Francaise. And this is why, and why? Because the artist's resale right actually started from France in 1920. There's this famous iconic artist, Jean-François Millet, who is well known today for his paintings of peasant farmers, and he was a leading figure of the Realism and Barbizon art schools, or art movements rather. But it wasn't always the case that he was famous. Once upon a time in 1860, a major work of his, Les Angelus, sold for just 1,000 francs in 1860. 14 years after the artist's death, it sold at an auction for over 500,000 pounds, 500,000 francs, to become the most expensive work at that time ever sold. Unfortunately, his family was living in abject poverty at that time. So it stirred up provocation, and people started talking about it, and the French government at that time got involved. After that, we had people like major artists like Paul Cézanne and Paul Gauguin suffering the same fate. At that time, it was very normal for artists to be poor, and meanwhile, their works are appreciated in value. Now, let me start with some local examples. This year, We lost one of the greatest artists of our day, David Dale. May God bless his soul. In his lifetime, he was courted by several collectors and patrons alike. I'm trying to bring it home because I talked about France earlier. Now I'm bringing it home. And collectors alike. And his works fetched staggering fees. But towards the end of his life, he was gravely ill. And of course, he couldn't work as much. He had a whole store of works which he had to keep selling just to keep, his living expenses paid and to ensure that, he could pay his medical bills. Meanwhile, his works flourished at the auctions. Now, I want to believe that if he had the artist's resale right to benefit from, that he would have been able to pay his bills better, and he probably will be alive till now. Another example, which is dear to me also, is the example of Berne Wong. I'm sure everyone is very aware of the record sale of £1.2 million for his masterpiece, Tutu. That's it there, to refresh our memory. And quite sadly, neither poor Oliver nor his siblings realized a penny from the sale. Next slide. There he is. Not one penny from the sale. £1.2 million. Now that's what's quite painful, so you can see why I'm agitated. So I'm not here to give a beautiful lecture. I'm combative today. Okay. But I believe that a true collector is deeply passionate about not only his work, but is passionate about the artist's career. He's passionate about the artist's welfare. And I know we have great collectors here in Nigeria, and I just hope that they're all here, they're listening to this lecture, and hoping that, that at the end of the day, they'll answer the moral question, which is how to support the artist in his career, because he's the one making the works. You want to appreciate his works. It's a status symbol, it's a value, it's a store of investment, but at the same time, you also have to give credence and support to those who are creating the pieces. Now, I know that a lot of collectors may not be happy with the artist's resale right, but there's a difference between fact and fallacy. And a lot of people have researched into the artist's resale right, and we find the following things. That, for instance, on the UK market, which is the second largest market in the world for art, there is no evidence that the artist's resale right has a negative impact on the UK market. There's absolutely no research to support that. So I know lots of collectors are worried, and I've heard this argument many times when collectors say things like, well, I bought the piece many years ago, and I paid the artist. And after paying the artist, why, for instance, many years later, should I keep paying the artist? Well, it's different. It works differently because it's not a home, it's not a house, it's not a piece of land. This is intellectual property that appreciates. And if the musicians and other creatives are able to benefit from their intellectual property rights, I don't see any reason why artists should not, especially if in other parts of the world, artists benefit from the intellectual property rights. So why is Africa different? Well, there are a few countries in Africa now that are benefiting, and I think that in Nigeria we should do the same. Well, I'll speak a little bit about the resale rights in that is resale rights. First, it is inalienable and cannot be waived, which means that the artist should not be boxed into a corner. He must have his right. It is managed through a system of compulsory collective management. Well, in the UK, the minimum sale threshold is €1,000 and is capped at €12,500. Now that means that the more expensive a work is, then the artist's resale rights begins to go down. For instance, if you take 5% from a work that is sold, say at €10,000, then maybe if it's a work that goes for £2 million, for instance, the resale percentage will drop as it goes higher in value. Now, since 2006, DACS, which is the collection management body in the UK, has paid £56 million in resale royalties to over 4,300 artists and estates. In 2016, DACS paid £9.2 million to over 1,630 artists and estates, with 306 receiving a royalty for the very first time. In Nigeria, nil. Now, what sorts of works are eligible? Original works, paintings, sculptures, they're all eligible. Even photographs in their copies are eligible as well, and even their proofs are eligible. They all qualify. Now, the resale rights applies when the resale involves an art market professional as a seller or a buyer or an intermediary. The royalty is payable by the seller or the buyer, but the art market professional is liable for its payment. Now, importantly, I'll give you an example in South Africa, and I think this is incisive for many of the auctions now that have done extremely well with African art. I think Mr. Giles Peppert, I didn't mention him earlier, he's here as well. A round of applause for Mr. Giles Peppert. Giles has done so much to the upliftment of the value of African art through Bonhams. And there's another Bonhams man, I won't introduce him yet, he'll be speaking later today. Now, Aspire Art Auctions is a South African art auction, and what they have done is to take the bull by the horns. They didn't wait for legislative framework in South Africa, but they went straight ahead to ensure that at their own auction sales, they make sure they give a percentage to the artist. And I think that's very incisive. Now, I spoke of Bonhams, and there's also Sotheby's, who have created art departments, that focus solely on African art. And I think that perhaps they'll want to give a little something back, especially if, African art continues to command global attention as it is now. Now, as at July 2017, African countries that recognize the African resale rights in their law include Algeria, Burkina Faso, Congo, Gabon, the Ivory Coast, Madagascar, Malawi, Mali, Senegal, and Tunisia. As noted earlier in this report, the African art market is not really well developed. It's just getting there. We're commanding global attention now. It represents less than 1% of the art world, of the world market. Yet because of the nature, of the reciprocal nature of the law, the African resale right is very important to African artists. Now, what do I mean by the reciprocal nature? It means that if a Nigerian artist sells big hair, and he sells on the European market as well, through major auctions, it means that even UK artists, they can sell hair, on our own auction and get the same 5%. So it works both ways. That's the reciprocal nature of the law. So it means that, any country that is signed up to that law, or respects that law rather, it means that if I sell a work, maybe at Bonhams, for instance, that's if the law is in place in Nigeria, it means that I can get 5%, of the value of the sale, and the same thing will happen if a UK artist, sells on the local market here. Now, but we're not taking advantage of that, and that's why I think it's extremely important for us to do this. So let me just read from my paper here. African art provides a classic situation where traditional works of art have become valuable and traded in international markets. As most African nations are relatively poor compared to nations with established art markets and where well-known African art is often traded, many believe that it's important that African artists have a way of sharing in the wealth created by their art without having to rely on the trust or charity of art market middlemen. Thus, if an African country adopts the artist resale rights legislation, it's artists that are able to share in the proceeds of traded artwork in any other country that has adopted resale rights legislation. This can be an important source of income for African artists. This reciprocity can become extremely important for artists whose work is regularly sold in Europe. So I'll leave that at that point, and I'll leave it for the panelists to discuss about how to implement the artist resale rights, how to manage, how to collect money for the artist, and how to remunerate the artist. And even when the artist is passed on, how to pass on to their heirs. I'll end with this quote. The Senegalese sculptor, Ousmane Sow, one of the early supports of the artist resale rights, was succinctly quoted. Artists do not live on thin air, and because they enrich the world with their art, they should be protected. So it is fair that those who trade in their works pay them a share of what they earn. That is the purpose of the resale right, to share all forms of enrichment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Enwuwu, for that enlightening session. Can we have 3 questions from the audience, please? Any hands? Any takers?
Good evening. I just wanted to find out, is there anything the government is doing to back your efforts? Is there anything in Nigerian legislation, given that we sort of have a similar prototype to British law?
Thank you.
Is there anything the government is doing? Well, let me leave that question to the Director General of the Nigerian Copyright Commission. He's here. There's also a representative from the National Gallery of Art, the Director General as well. I think he's better positioned to answer the question. But I feel that the important thing maybe the Society of Nigerian Artists is doing is to create this platform where we can have them speak to us and we're able to work with them to ensure that this artist resale right is implemented here in Nigeria. Okay.
Hello. What happens when work fall in value?
Sorry?
When the value of artworks fall.
In value?
Yeah. What will happen in the matter of resale?
Well, nothing really happens. I mean, in developed countries where you have the artist resale right, you know, they cap it. You have a lower estimate and a high estimate. Some works may not even be eligible in the first place if they don't reach the lower estimate. But for instance, in Senegal, where it's very developed, they have a very strong and robust system. You know, it doesn't matter the value. So whatever the price is for your work, you know, the artist still gets a percentage for his resale right.
I enjoyed your presentation very much.
Thank you.
My name is Giles Pepiot. I'm the person who sold Tutu, whenever it was, a year ago, and in London. But I fully agree with the principle behind artist resale right. I think it is important. But I think the crucial fact that perhaps you might have slightly overlooked is that this is money, or this money comes from the collector. It doesn't come from Bonhams or Sotheby's, from the auction house. It comes from the collector. And certainly our experience is that collectors will try to sell their work where they pay the least commissions and have the least deductions. And whilst that might not be significant in a work that is £100,000, you're talking about a £5,000 fee. But when you're talking about a work that's £1 million, well, that really is quite a significant deduction. And I suppose that the question to you is, do you think that the imposition of this, it would be a worthwhile sacrifice to see the market in Lagos diminish because people would be unwilling to sell works within the jurisdiction here?
Okay, that's a good question, Giles. But I mentioned earlier that there hasn't been any research, even in the UK market, which is the second largest market, art market in the world. There hasn't been any research to support the fact that, you know, it diminishes the art market in any way.
I was going to wait for time for discussion in general, but
Okay.
I think I will speak now. For collectors who sell, you already have about 30% or more coming out of your sales and commission. And out of that, you got tax. I'm not against resale. I think it's an excellent idea, but please don't compare it with literature. It's not the same at all, because the author does not take financial risks. It is the publisher that takes the financial risk. And the publisher publishes in multiple copies. There's no publisher will go below 500 copies, for instance, and then pays you royalty for giving your work to him, but he's taking the financial risk, not the writer. The writer, like let's say my husband, he has a paper and pen, and he pays for somebody to type because he can't type. But majority of writers nowadays can do their own typing. So it's a matter of buying your laptop, your fingers, and your creative imagination. But the actual bringing out the work to the public is not, the risk is not taken by the writer. Whereas the artist takes the financial risk. That's why I say I'm not against the resale. You have to buy your canvas, you got to buy all your material, and then you go to sell it.
Yes.
Sometimes you even have to market yourself. But in terms of comparing it with the author, that's why I'm really here to tell you, don't do that.
Okay.
It's not the same market at all. And when it comes to Nigeria, the writer doesn't see royalty after about 3 years.
Okay.
Something else happens because you have pirates coming in and all sorts of factors coming in Nigeria, but not abroad probably. So please have your resale rights, but don't compare that resale right to other literary or artistic genres. It's not there. And also have pity too on the collectors, who also have taken some financial risks. Okay? All right, we go to the little ones who are just coming out. And then they may increase, but they may not increase. And you may not even sell.
Yes.
And you're sticking to England. You haven't gone to America.
Yes.
And I know why.
I'll respond.
Because America has flat refused
Yes, I'll respond.
to key into that resale right law. It won't do it because it says that it will affect the art market in America.
Yes.
And Congress has flatly refused to key into
Yes.
that. But please, I am for it, really for it. But I'm just saying, be careful of comparison and make sure you present it well for those who collect. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Clark. If I'm going to respond to that, I mean, it's a great comment. It's not really a question, but if I'm going to respond to that, I think the comparison just lay in the fact that it has to do with intellectual property. That's really what the comparison was all about. That's on that. And then with the US market, of course, I know that they don't have that legislation, and that's why I said, well, if the US market isn't working, or if they haven't accepted it, well, the UK market is there. And I also brought in Africa. The UK market is the second largest in the world, and I brought in Africa, that if it's happening on our own continent, perhaps we should also look into it. Thank you. So just one more question. Okay, Neil was going to clap. Okay, go ahead. Okay. Okay. All right. All right, I think we can go on to the next person.
Okay.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is the Nigerian representative for Bonhams, a leading international auction house for modern and contemporary art. His main interest lies in documentation and research, and he is presently working on several research projects to catalogue the works of major Nigerian artists, including Benetton and Felix Idubo. An avid art collector and connoisseur of wine, in the past 20 years, he has built one of the finest personal art collections in Nigeria. Please let us welcome Mr. Neil Coventry to speak on the global market for Nigerian art.
Thanks. Okay. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to give this talk on the global market for Nigerian art. In a room full of experts on the global market for Nigerian art. So thanks for that. I'd like to speak freely, but if I do, it's going to take hours. So I'm going to stick to my script, so I might have my head down for a while, so apologies for that. So first of all, what qualifies as Nigerian art? The global market for Nigerian art. For the purposes of this talk, I'll include art by modern and contemporary Nigerian artists in Nigeria and the diaspora, ranging from Professor Berne to Njideka Akinyele Crosby. This could be slightly misleading, as they tend to belong to separate markets. So I won't talk too much about the diaspora Nigerian artists, as I'm interested mostly in the modern. So just to clarify, the modern art includes artists such as Professor Berne Yusuf Grillo, Damas Norco, and of course, esteemed Professor Bruce Onoprapea. So thank you for being with us today. Although I would add that Wong, as you said in your documentary, was in a class of his own, a modern artist of vast international repute, dating back to the 30s and 40s, having exhibited with Picasso in Paris in 1946, and held solo exhibitions in UK, Europe, and the US in the 40s and 50s. But I'll come back to this. Contemporary Nigerian artists with international representations, usually in the diaspora, Shonibare, Crosby, and co. And contemporary artists in the local market with a growing global appeal and global market. Of course, there's a lot of overlap, but I'm not going to discuss the pros and cons of the African categorization, as this does also happen in Chinese, Russian, Indian, and so on art. Perhaps a discussion for a future event, Oliver. So, African art. This is what you get when you Google African art. Experience the mega African art market. If you could go to the next slide, this is the page you get when you Google African art. Nigerian art is slightly better when you Google it, but essentially this is the perception, the general global perception of art from Africa, at least in my experience. I think you can probably ask Giles, he might get a few of these sent to him every week for valuation. And yeah, it's a problem, because this is not what people in this room perceive to be African art, and we have a lot of artists in this room who also have to battle this perception. I wasn't going to dwell on this for too long, but it is a problem. But anyway, regarding the talk, I didn't know if you wanted a bunch of facts and figures or my opinion, but you're going to get my opinion with a few facts and figures just to fill in the gaps. But I'll try and be nice as I can. Nigerian art has had a global market for the last 80 years. As I mentioned, Berne first exhibited in London in 1937. All his pieces in that exhibition sold. And Wong also exhibited in Paris, as I said, and multiple venues in the US in the 1950s. Yusuf Grillo, Jim Okolo, Damas Norco, Professor Bruce Onoprapea have all exhibited in London and across Europe and the US since the 1960s to date. So this is not a new thing. What is a new thing is the scale and interest globally, with the auction houses, primarily Bonhams, obviously, the art fairs, and the increasing number of Africa-focused galleries. Early attempts at creating an international market for Nigerian and African art were held in 1999 and 2000. Bonhams held the first sale of modern contemporary African art in Chelsea in September 2000. Next slide, where a large and important Berne, now in the Smithsonian, sold for £1,400, which is shocking. And Ella Natsui failed to sell for £1,500, and this work failed to sell for, next slide please, for £700. And I mean, this is it's absurd when you consider that was just 19 years ago. In fact, the entire catalogue could have been bought for £50,000, and that catalogue today, if it was auctioned, would most likely make in excess of £2 million. So yeah, 19 years from 50,000 to 2 million. That's quite a growth in the international market. 7 years later, Giles was to sell a couple of Mwonwus for next to nothing. And I won't say how much, but he might as well have given them away. But not as bad as Christie's, who sold, the next slide, please. Okay, that's the £700 thing. Next slide. they sold this incredible work for £375, and an Anyanwu, next slide please, for £360 in 2007. In fact, they sold 2 of them for that price, which is ridiculous. 2 years later, Bonhams decided to take a chance on the market and had their first sort of new section of new set of African auctions. And on the 3rd of October this year, in about a couple of weeks, Bonhams will hold the next Africa auction. So together with South African and African art, that makes a total of probably almost 40 auctions now since 2007. So quite an improvement on the 2000 auction. As several of you in this room know me, you'll guess that I'll be using Benetton as a case study for the success of Nigerian art globally. As I mentioned, in his lifetime, Nwomu was an extremely successful artist. In 1950, Time magazine called him Africa's greatest artist. And many of you will know, because it was in the movie, he sculpted the Queen in 1957. No mean feat for a Nigerian artist who 13 years earlier had only just traveled out of Nigeria. And Nwomu's name has always been held in high regard in Nigeria, but globally, his works were slipping through the net. Bearing in mind now that Nwomu's works at Bonhams alone between 2012 and 2016 totaled $3.5 million. And then in 2018, Tutu sold, as has already been mentioned, for $1.7 million. And to go back to the Christie's Anyawus, the work that sold for £370, the same work at Bonhams in 2010 sold for £160,000. And then later on, a couple of years later, for £190,000. So $250,000 for a piece that had sold for £360. So again, the global market clearly growing. Now the boring stuff. Next slide, please. Yeah, there you go. This is the Nigerian art market report from 2016, compiled by Jess Castellote and Yinka Fisher. The total value of Nigerian art sold at auction in the 5 years between 2012 and 2016 was $7.2 million. Half of this was Nwomu. In 2007, the total was about $5,000. So again, from $5,000 to $7.2 million, not a bad increase. Nigerian artists alone at one Bonham sale in 2016 counted for 60 of the works. The other 37 were from the rest of Africa. The total Nigerian values were 2.74 million, and the total values were 2.74 million, and the total Nigerian value was 2.26 million. So a huge section of that, obviously coming from Nigeria. 64% of art sold at Bonhams in that 5-year period was from Nigeria. So not a bad indicator of the global market. So that's it, no more facts and figures. Next slide. Right, this is something that came out in ArtNet, I think last week or something. So as it says, there's no such thing as an African art market yet. So now that Nwomu is not being given away, the values are rising steadily, and the collector base for Nigerian art is growing. But that's not enough, not by a long way. If we want to see a truly global market for Nigerian art, we have a lot of work to do, and it's already started, but it must move faster, and we must join forces. Auction houses, art fairs, and galleries all play a vital role in the global market for Nigerian art. But I believe that we need to do more, otherwise the market may come to a halt. These issues relate more to the modern artists than the contemporary, but I think the latter rely on the former. There are several areas where work is being done, but I think more needs to be done. Firstly, research. Quite a bit being done internationally, and obviously a lot of research by the late, great B.C. Silva and the CCA. PhDs by people like Perrin Lathrop at Stanford on Akinola Lashakan, which comes at a critical time because there are a huge number of fake Lashakans doing the rounds, but I'll get back to that. The second area is publishing. There are more and more books on Nigerian art being published, but again, the market could use more pictorial books on Abalu, Lashakan, Nwomu, Grillo, etc. Which leads me to the next point, which Olive already mentioned, or I think the compere mentioned, cataloguing. Absolutely vital. Focusing on the works themselves, so we have a clearer understanding of the number of works and the range of works by a particular artist. Working with Oliver on the catalogue raisonné for his father, which I think we need to sort of get done as soon as possible, because, yeah, it needs to be done. And without this research, I can't see the modern Nigerian art being taken seriously, or as seriously as it should be, by international institutions. And there will be repercussions for Nigerian art in general if the research isn't there. Which leads me to the next point. Same point, really, but a stronger emphasis on provenance and a clamp down on forgeries. I'll go into this in a bit more detail again. The last and perhaps most important is public access to works, museums, public and private. Perhaps a question for your panel when they are up here. The lack of documentation and provenance, if left unchecked, will have an effect, and the market could quite easily crash. I mean, a little bit dramatic, but I think it's true. The contemporary and diaspora artists should still continue to thrive, as there is an emphasis with them on exhibition research and publishing. Plus the artists are alive to defend themselves, which a few of the modern artists are not. So yes, with the modern artists, this is not the case. There is much we don't know about modern Nigerian art. With more research and publications, I think the global market would open up, and the collector base would also increase. We'd find more works, and we'd know more about them. Bonham's had an auction in New York in May this year, and we'll have another one next year, and it was a huge success. But the market is still young, and there are still a lot of people we need to convince. And I think the way to do that, again, is through research. If you go to the next slide, please. On the left, you have work, Negritude, 1988, by Professor Berne. And on the right, you have a work by American Harlem Renaissance artist Aaron Douglas that was produced probably some 5 or 6 decades earlier. And I don't know about you, but to me, that's just, I mean, look at the posture, look at the geometric shapes in the background. They're almost one and the same. So I'm sure there's a link. There has to be a link, perhaps with this piece in particular. But what is the link between Enwonwu and the Harlem Renaissance? I can't prove it yet, but I think it's the Parisian jazz and dance club scene of the 1930s and 40s. Josephine Baker, South African artist and jazz trumpeter Joe Sokoto, and the subject of a book read by Enwonwu whilst he was at Oxford in 1945, Africa Dances, the Senegalese dancer. Next slide, please. Based in Paris, Farrell Benga. And there he is. Quite incredible. Again, no proof, but lots of clues. If you go to the next slide, you'll see Ogolo on the right. It's the same posture, to me. I think there's certainly a link. And if you go to the next slide, a sculpture of Farrell Benga, the dancer, by Harlem Renaissance sculptor Richmond Barthé. And here's Enwonwu in DC in 1950, next slide please, with Richmond Barthé at Enwonwu's exhibition. So they met. Then you go to the next slide, you have a portrait of Farrell Benga by the Harlem Renaissance artist James Porter. The next slide is a painting by James Porter, painted in Nigeria, Storm over Jos. And the next slide is a Smithsonian painting, Storm over Biafra. Clearly, there's overlap between Enwonwu and the Harlem Renaissance. Yet there's no documentation of this, there's no research to this effect. But it's there. And with that research, I'm certain there'd be a lot more interest in his work internationally. But it has to be done and it has to be put out there. So yeah, maybe we talk about that later on. And now, the bit I find most interesting. Next slide, please. The global forgery market for Nigerian art. I mean, this is unbelievable. You don't have to be an art expert, an art lover, or an artist to see that this is just appalling work. So yeah, the situation is ridiculous, unsophisticated, and collectors are spending millions of naira on these things. I mean, they got the pose, it's the Feral Benga pose, but I think their influence may have come from elsewhere. Next slide, please. So it's, I mean, it's, you know, yeah, just to make a point, this is how ridiculous it is. And it gets worse. If you go to the next slide, please. So yeah, a lot of you will be familiar with this painting. I showed it at the beginning. But something's not quite right. If you go to the next slide, there's the real one. Next slide. Yeah. So there you go. I think someone sent this to you, Giles, didn't they? Yeah, tried to flog it to Giles, who knew where the original was. But this is happening. And it's not happening in Nigeria. This is happening in England. Not that it makes any difference, but you know, it's up to people here to stop this from happening. So yeah, keep going, please. Again, just you know, not a bad drawing, but not by Berne Wong, as far as I can tell. But if you go to the next slide, there's his signature. So that takes that piece from being worth 20 quid to being worth 20,000 or 200,000. Next slide, please. Here's another one. 1 penny for this lovely Berne Wong on eBay. Isn't it nice? Go to the next slide, please. And there it is. And the next slide, please. And there's what they nicked it from. There you go. So someone probably bought it, and they probably paid a few £1,000s for it. Giles sold that one for cheap in 2007, just so you all know. Yeah, I bought it. Sorry. Next slide, please. Just a blatant, horrible fake, I hope. Otherwise, I just put my foot in it. Next slide, please. Another one. Next slide, please. Yeah, I mean, no, Will, go back, please. Yeah, I mean, again, horrible. Next slide, please. So what they've done with this one, they've nicked it from different places. Next slide, please. Yeah, they've taken this one, which was a Bonham's piece. Next slide, please. And they've just merged the two and made this repulsive thing in the middle. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. I'll get to her, sorry. Yeah, just keep it there. Okay, so, yeah, this is my favorite. This one's brilliant. Next slide, please. The Queen of England. This is by Aina Onabolu, painted in 1930 and sold as the Queen Mother. But clearly this is not the Queen Mother. This is the Queen. And this was painted in 1930 when the Queen was 4 years old. So there's no need to test the paint or the canvas or anything because the Queen was 4 years old. And it's ridiculous. If you go to the next picture, there she is on Google. You just Google the Queen, and there it is. They just took this. And the next one is, they're doing the same thing in China, but they're not signing it Aina Onabolu. They're just, that's the artist's name, Tang Yong. So, yeah, and the next one, please. Okay, so yes. So if you bought any of those, ask for your money back. And if you sold any of those, you should probably leave, but very quietly, because everyone's now watching. But it doesn't stop there. Could you do another, please? Herbert Macaulay. Aina Onabolu again, December 1944. This is taken from the 1 naira note. Next slide, please. I mean, at least try. You could zoom in on that if you go to the next slide. Yeah, there he is. And the next one. Yeah, and the next one. No. Next one. No, I've missed it. Okay, so anyway, go back. Yeah, thanks. So I have a photo. I don't know how I didn't make it. A photo of Herbert Macaulay in 1946. He was an old, old man. He did not look like this in 1944. So again, there's no need to test the paint or use ultraviolet light or infrared, whatever. It's just fake, and it's sad. But there you go. And then the next slide, please. This is Mungo Park, who died, I think, what is it? Let me check. In 1806, so 76 years before Onabolu was born. And, Onabolu was not copying etchings. He was painting from life, so there's no way he could have painted him. I don't have a picture of the painting signed by Onabolu, but it looks exactly like that because they just took it off the internet. And the next one is Frederick Lugard in all his winter clothes, supposedly painted in Nigeria. There's a painting out there that looks a lot like that. And again, it's not real. So there you go. Quite sad. And they're not just doing this with paintings, they're doing this with bronzes. They're recasting bronzes. It's a little harder to pick out the bronzes. But if we had the research and we had the provenance and we had the documentation, then we'd know. No matter how good the fake, Fash, did you get here? No matter how good the fakes are, you'd be able to tell. And at the moment, I don't think it's foolproof. There's a lot of work to do to put an end to this. Again, I was going to suggest maybe another panel discussion about this. You could rent the hall of the EFCC for that one, perhaps, so we can get them on it when they'll be here. Okay, good. Anyway, on a positive note, let me get back to... can you go to the next slide, see what that is? Okay, leave that there, I think, for now. Contemporary art from Nigeria and Africa at the moment is going from strength to strength. There's no doubt about that. Bonhams and the other international auction houses are all involved. Bonhams leading the charge, of course. The art fairs focused on Africa in London, Marrakesh, and New York by 154. Also known as Africa in Paris, Artex in Nigeria, and the Cape Town and Joburg art fairs in South Africa. There are institutions, the Museum of Contemporary African Art in Cape Town, the Tate Modern have a focus on Africa. They've been acquiring Nigerian art. The Smithsonian recently acquired its second Nwamu sculpture, and galleries representing Nigerian artists in all these countries. Tyburn Gallery, Taffeta, Gallery of African Art, Tiwani, Jack Bell, October, Goodman Galleries. And those are just some of the African art galleries in London. So clearly, there's a lot of global interest and excitement around contemporary art from Africa and Nigeria. But one tiny point that has been brought to my attention, I don't have an opinion on it, but I'm going to read it to you anyway, because this is from a well-known artist in Nigeria who has sent me this, and I said I would read it. The making of the single-story narrative of art from Africa and Africa diaspora. This time we're doing it to ourselves. It used to be that the West told Africa's story on their behalf, and it was the one-story narrative. Now we are free to express ourselves on our own terms, and all we do is copy one another for marketability. It seems those who decide the value of art from Africa and Africa diaspora are initiators in this single story of art from Africa. They show a limited spectrum of narratives. They show that only a specific narrative can be successful commercially. It is disproportionately promoted. The unfortunate effect of this is that artists buy into the game with the hope that they too will become collectible. This single story style narrative has become a trend. Trends will never last. The unfortunate thing is the market gets saturated and the interest diminishes. Then it's off to the next single story, then we flog the hell out of it. Again, not necessarily my opinion, but something I think to consider when looking at the pitfalls of contemporary art from Africa. But these photos came along with the email. This is in Njideka. The next slide, please. Kehinde Wiley, both highly successful contemporary artists. And then just zoom through the rest, please. Yeah, keep going. So this is the point this artist is trying to make, is that there's a lot of repetition and a lot of imitation. And they're all lovely works. Stop there, thanks. But an interesting point, I think, to consider, again, maybe something to talk about in the future. So we've covered research, provenance, publications, and the final item is best summed up by Professor Berne Wong, printed in the West Africa Pilot in 1948. The article titled, "The Proposal to Build a Museum for Tomorrow." And Wong writes, "Every nation has its past, but woe unto that nation whose past has been left to decay." Fast forward to 2003, Kunle Fulani's article, "Museums in Nigeria, Historical Antecedents and Current Practices." Fulani writes, "Since independence in 1960, the political landscape of Nigeria has been characterized by incessant change of government. Until recently, governance was generally marred by military intervention, which stifled democracy and made effective management of public institutions impossible. A valid point, perhaps, from which the institutions are now recovering, an important step in ensuring the steady growth of the global art market for Nigerian art. Fulani also writes, little, if any, interest is generated by wealthy organizations and individuals in the development of museums in Nigeria. Well, I think 16 years later, with the sort of near completion now of the Shillong Museum, we have that to look forward to, and I think that is going to make a huge difference to the perception of art from Nigeria and will aid the global market a great deal, I feel. The institutions play a vital role in the market. Museums, universities, art historians, and so on. Nigerian artists and the global art market for Nigerian art could benefit greatly from the development of museums, both private and public. So to sum up, if we, the collectors, museums, curators, auctioneers, artists, so many of you here, art estates, foundations, want to see the market grow globally, then we must do our bit locally. The global market for Nigerian art is out there and it is growing. Crosby, Shonibare, even dare I say, Anatsui, I think Nigeria can claim him now to some degree, have proven this, as have Wong, Grillo, Professor Bruce, Onopropea. We need to protect what we have and stop those who seek to profit from doing it damage. There's too much to lose, not just monetary value, but more importantly, culture, heritage, knowledge, and national pride. As for artist resale rights, I'm going to make myself very unpopular in a room full of artists here. I think the principle is correct and noble. I just worry that, you say there's no evidence that it has an effect, but you look at New York versus Europe, where people would prefer to sell their works, is where they're not having to risk people having to pay more for them. And I think we need to make Nigerian art accessible and easy to obtain at this juncture. I think it's a critical time of growth, and it's an early stage of growth. But that's just my opinion, anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Can we have 3 questions from the audience, please?
Thank you,
okay.
Neil. I seem to be dominating the questions. I'm very sorry about this. I thought your talk was most interesting, but I think you certainly touched upon one, in my view, great hole in the art scene, art community here in Nigeria, and that is museums. I think that the fact that there is not a national museum in Abuja, obviously there's one here in Lagos, but certainly I think a national museum should be something that one looks at and holds with pride, and it should be something that encourages and works to encourage the art market and the art world and artists in all ways. And I just think that I'm very worried about the establishment of private museums, because I think the National Museum should be the one that takes the lead in these matters. And maybe this is a question for, if there's anyone from the National Museum here to address, but how could the national museums be encouraged here in Nigeria?
Am I going to answer that, or is there somebody else that would like to? Well, I think it's sort of probably... Ooh, do we have anybody? Yeah. Well, like I read from the Kunle Fulani article from 2003, this was not a priority, I don't think, for many years. I mean, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it was, and I think it now is. But then there are lots of things that are private in Nigeria because, I guess we're playing catch up after many years of, I'm not sure what the word is, but I'll leave it there. But is there a national airline? Not yet, but there was. So yeah, I think the museum. I think private museums is a good thing because you have to have museums, and maybe that will just kickstart something that that would affect what the government do. But I don't think I'm not the right person to answer this question. But thanks for asking that awkward and difficult question, Mr. Pepiat. I'm so glad you're here. Any easy questions for me? Oh, good. Follow. This better be good.
My name is Frank Ugiomo. I quite enjoyed the way you dismissed paintings that were copied along line realities of presence. But I want to inform that even with sculptures or bronze casting you mentioned and you lost hope about, that the physicists have provided an approach called thermoluminescent dating for assessing the last time a monumental heat formed an object. So with that, date is accurate to the point. So it's just by way of information. Thank you.
That's enlightening. Thank you. I did not know that. But is that technology available here?
Well, what Nigerians have done is to send bits out to Germany, UK, and they get the result.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
All right, to begin the panel discussion, I'm pleased to introduce the panel moderator, who is a legal practitioner and arts consultant. She works with individuals and organizations in the creative sector to develop and establish administrative structures, initiate programs, build and train teams, address local and international concerns, as well as forge strategic collaborations. With a round of applause, let's welcome Michelle Nali to lead the discussion on legislation and implementing artist resale rights in Nigeria.
All right, so as she introduced, my name is Michelle Ali. I'm a legal practitioner and an arts consultant. I will be calling all my panelists to please come and have their seat. So if I call your name, please just come and take your seat. Mr. John Asien, is he in the room? Okay, can we give him a round of applause, please? Thank you very much. I believe Mr. Femi, yeah, anywhere, please, feel free. Would you want to sit next to me? Since you're first. Okay, Mr. Femi Lijadu is not around, but I hear he's being represented by Adi Adekola. Is Mr. Adi Adekola in the room? Not here yet, okay. All right, Mrs. Ungozi Aderigbe. Can we give a round of applause, please? Thank you. And then Mr. Simon Ikparoyi is not around as well. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing properly. Please excuse me. He's being represented by Mr. Ajene Isegbe. Isegbe? Please, sir. Thank you very much. Please come on stage. Welcome, sir. All right, thank you. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us and sticking with us. So the panel discussion we'll just jump right in, and I'll be asking my panelists a few questions. I hope you're all ready. I think this is a very, it can be a tricky topic to discuss actually, because you support it, and then on one hand, you're thinking about implementation and how it could actually work, you know, in the strict sense of it. Okay, so let's talk about maybe the existing laws, you know, both internationally and nationally as well. I know there's the Nigerian copyrights. I'm sorry, I'm not going to really introduce because I think their bios are in the program already. So we'll just jump, you know, go right into the discussions. Thank you, please. Existing laws, you know, both international and national. I will start with you, sir, Mr. John Asien. Can you please tell us a bit about the Berne Convention and, you know, is Nigeria a member?
Well, thank you very much, and Thanks for giving me this opportunity to say one or two things. And good evening, everyone. It's such a wonderful thing being in the midst of artists. And coming from the Nigerian Copyright Commission, it's something I've always looked forward to. We've not been having this kind of conversation, and I think we need more of this. Well, the piracy and fake art thing, we'll come down back to that, and we'll have a session where we'll address that squarely. Now, Nigeria is a member of the Berne Convention. The Berne Convention was concluded in 1886. It presently has about 177 countries. Nigeria joined September 1993. And even before we joined the Berne Convention, we had anticipated some of the provisions. And a lot of the provisions, like the one that was mentioned on the artist resale right, had been anticipated even before we passed the present copyright statute in 1988. So to a large extent, we are not only in Berne, we also are largely Berne compliant in terms of our copyright legislation.
Can you then tell us if there's actually a provision? I think I would also ask, thank you. I would also ask Mrs. Aderigbibe as well about this, but is there any provision in our own local laws, so Nigerian Copyrights Copyrights Act, on the artist resale, on the
artist resale rights?
Yes.
The answer is yes. Section 13 of the Copyright Act, more or less, takes the whole provisions of Berne and puts in the Copyright Act. Okay. So as far as we're concerned, I mean, it's probably late now to debate whether or not Nigeria should have the artist resale rights. The provision in Berne is optional, and Nigeria had adopted that provision, and it is in a national law. So as far as Nigeria is concerned, there is a provision making it mandatory for any auction, for the artist to enjoy some recompense whenever his work is sold in an auction, or for artists, for authors. Madam, you did say something about not comparing both, but you pardon me here. But for authors, when a manuscript is sold, you also will enjoy the resale rights. Under the law, it's called the resale right, the right to be recompensed. So that provision exists. The only gap is that the section says that the provision for the activation of that section will have to be by way of a regulation to be made by the Nigerian Copyright Commission, and we haven't gotten around to making that regulation.
I will come to that
so
in a minute.
So it's not active at the moment, yeah.
Yes, I understand that. Okay, are there any other local laws, ma'am, that you're aware of, or maybe a bill that still hasn't been passed, for example? Are you aware of any?
I mean, I have nothing to add. If the DG of NCC has answered, I can't add anything to that.
All right, no problem. Maybe anybody else in the audience actually can help with that. But moving on swiftly, in terms of reciprocating countries, and obviously when works are being sold, again, if the country is not part of, if the country doesn't recognize, the artist's rights, getting a percentage in sales. What happens then? I mean, and how would you suggest that, that sort of problem should be tackled? Say for Nigerian artists receiving works from eligible works in, say, the UK or anywhere else.
Okay, so I'll go back to the Berne Convention just to give a bit of background. The Berne Convention basically seeks to unify copyright laws across member states to an extent. And so one of the key principles of the Berne Convention is what is called the national treatment. Basically, it means the member states are enjoined to give the same treatment to foreign works as they would to their own nationals. It does make an exception, however, when it comes to artist resale rights. So like he rightly mentioned, it is contained there, but it makes it optional. Now, I should say that the Berne Convention sets us a minimum standard. So the provisions are generally like a minimum standard that member states should implement. But then when it came to this particular issue, it made it optional. And it means that a member state is not obligated to have it as part of its local laws. But then it also says that a member state that decides to adopt it as part of its local laws is not obligated to extend that protection or that benefit to an artist unless the artist's home country also provides that same advantage or benefit. So there are two things I need to point out. Number one is that for any artist's work to enjoy the right of resale, his home country must protect it, and then in the country he seeks to enforce it, that country also must protect it. So you can't enforce it if one of these two elements are missing. Okay. Back to Nigeria, he said rightly, we have in our legislation, the Nigerian Copyright Act is clear, there is provision for artists' resale rights. Even though the implementation framework for that has not been given yet. But to the extent that we are speaking of a legal right, there is indeed a legal right that the courts will recognize, in my view. A Nigerian artist who then seeks to enforce that in a foreign jurisdiction would have a basis because his home country already provides for that. So the question would then be, does that jurisdiction provide for resale rights? Okay. If that jurisdiction provides for resale right, then he can probably enjoy it. Now, from a practical point of view, this is where there's a bit of it becomes a bit tricky because the implementation of this kind of rights is not really as straightforward as you would think. And the reason is because you can always track the sale of an original work in a global market.
Exactly.
You need to have some system, some coordination around it. And that is the missing gap. Mm-hmm. So hopefully, what we need to do on this side in Nigeria is to, have that implementation framework that makes it practically, that makes it doable in a practical sense.
And we'll touch on that in a bit because we're still, just discussing the laws that actually exist. So the next half of the panel would address, implementation and management as well. Okay, let me just quickly ask Mr. Ajani Segwe, you've been a bit quiet. So I understand there was a proposed National Gallery of Arts bill, which actually has the definition of resale rights in it, and also discusses what should happen in the primary and in the primary and secondary markets. I think it had its first reading in November 16, 2010. But it still hasn't been, passed as law to date. Can you perhaps maybe tell us some strategies that, the National Gallery of Art is adopting to, engage with our legislators, and other people that, you believe can be very crucial in these stages?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Ajede Isegbe, as introduced. I represent the Director General, Dr. Simon Ikpakroni, who was supposed to be here yesterday, but called me this morning that I should come because of some other urgent assignment. We all know that the National Gallery of Art is a government agency, and we operate a policy formulation and implementation, and also coordinating. So the law that enabled the establishment of National Gallery of Art through the Act of 1993 got the amendment in 2004. And then since to that period, there has not been any review or amendment of that law until since the new proposal was made since 2010. And that 2010 amendment bill, there were provisions to take care of so many interests of the artist. I am an artist myself, I'm a sculptor, and I've been in the gallery. I have been following up the hectic processes of getting that bill amended to take care of the artist's interest. And even good enough, president, SNA president is on the board of the National Gallery of Art, and we've been working together. And up to now that we are talking, the bill has not gotten through the National Assembly to get the assent for the implementation. And then if this bill is not, assented for implementation, there are areas that we cannot operate. Like the areas of, for instance, the monitoring of the movement of the artworks, the other areas concerning the revenue generations and the protection. All these are not within our control presently, but they are all provided within the enabling law that when it is passed, the artists have a lot to benefit, including the protection of their rights. But for now, we are handicapped. We cannot go beyond where we are. It has been a very big burden to the gallery.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess, did you want to add something?
Well, thank you very much, my brother. We're coming from the same point, that's the federal government. Unfortunately, I haven't read the bill from the gallery on artists and the management of the arts. But I would say that certainly there will be more than one agency handling different aspects of the arts. As far as the resale rights are concerned, it's very important that we must draw from the international benchmarks. There are obligations in the multi-national treaties, and at the moment, there are discussions on making that provision of the Berne Convention compulsory.
Yes, I'm aware that you're very much involved in.
Yes, so Senegal and Congo have put a paper in WIPO, which is going to be discussed further in October on this, coming up with a mandatory provision. And that's to ensure that a country like Nigeria that has that provision will benefit from other countries that are members of the Berne Convention. So I will read that bill. I will see whether there's a provision on the resale rights, and then see how we align that with what already exists. Well, like I said, the Copyright Act already has provided.
Because then you don't even want a duplicity as well with.
Yes, it will not be safe
existing.
to have the same provision in different laws and maybe saying different things and providing different conditions under different supervisions. That would just be a recipe for chaos.
All right, that would be really helpful. Okay, thank you very much for that. So in terms of implementation, I think let's just go right into that. What would you say can you share some of the efforts that the Nigerian Copyright Commission has been making? Maybe not even as a government, parastatal now, maybe on a more personal level, because I know you've even written very extensively on, copyright laws. Would you like to share some of the efforts that have been made?
Well, I'm sorry, I may not be able to speak on the personal efforts now because I'm more or less wearing the official cap.
Yes, I understand that.
But I've been with the Copyright Commission long enough to know that this has been a very long gap. I think it's a provision that both the beneficiaries and the trustees of the power just didn't know what to do or thought it was safer to just leave it there. Like some of the provisions of the Copyright Act, it's just been there. The law says the artist, and in the case of manuscripts, the author have these rights. It says that the Nigerian Copyright Commission is to work out the regulations for the activation of that section. Neither the artists have called for the activation, nor has the NCC at some point in the 90s had brought some artists together to discuss this. But my feeling then was that either there wasn't sufficient commitment to having this activated, or we're all still looking at global best practices, and that took a while. And in that period, maybe other things got us all occupied, and no one went back to this. So as it is, we've not had a sustained conversation or interrogation of how this should be activated. And I also sense that there might be, like it happens in many other jurisdictions, there might be some interest that feel, look, this is not the time to discuss this. And so that box has been under lock and key for a while. And now we're beginning to talk about it. And I think the box is going to be opened. Then we're going to interrogate that section and see what to do with it.
Definitely. Maybe when we get to our question and answers session, I know there are a couple of artists in the building, so it would be great to hear, the sort of provisions that they would even need. I mean, yes, the artist rights, the resale rights. However, what could be some of the reasons why those rights may not even work? If there are any collectors as well that can engage, it will be really fantastic. But even looking forward as well, yes, if we're even agreeing that there should be a if we're even agreeing that artists that right should be there and governed properly, what sort of schemes are we looking at? What sort of percentage are we looking at? I mean, yes, we've been discussing what happens in the UK, but what sort of remuneration should artists even be getting? Whether living or dead. Can you advise on any? Can you? That's what I'm saying. Maybe yeah.
Okay.
Maybe you should start first.
I'll just take a risk. I don't understand this business so well, but I'll take the risk. First, I think Nigeria has to design its own framework. We have more than enough experts in the room to guide us on percentages. We have practices in other jurisdictions that will guide us. So we understand the global best practices. But I would say that even if it's 1%, 1% of anything is better than 100% of what we have now, which is 0. That's my point. If it's just to make the point that you can't have a provision in your law and not activate it, I think we owe the artist that activation. Secondly, I'm still very curious to understand why the estate of Benetton would not receive, even if it's a penny, not even a penny from the resale of Tutu. Now, it might be it's because we don't have our own mechanism. So although we have a provision in our law, although we have reciprocal agreement, extension provisions with the UK, although we both belong to the same Berne Convention, and the two countries have these provisions in their laws, I'll be curious to know why they didn't put a penny down. But then, because we have not activated, because there is no collecting society that manages that right, there will be no reciprocal implementation of those provisions. So that may have worked against us. So if that's a reason why, if only for making that point, in principle, let's have a 1%. It's better than nothing. But I think if we work with the artist, work with the gallery, we could come up with percentages that would not, break any bank.
All right, ma'am. Would you like to add anything, ma'am? Or
okay, I would just add that in terms of, like you said, we have to look at what works for us. Learning from international best practices. I think under the UK there's a range from between 4% and I think 7 or so, something like that. But we can work out something that benefits everybody. The point I would also want to bring to the fore is the fact that as a body of artists, knowledge is important. And because I've spoken with a number of artists who never knew that these rights exist, and you can't enforce what you're ignorant of. So I think that what has happened before now is the fact that it's because there wasn't a lot of information around this. But today we're having this conversation. Hopefully the conversation will continue, and then we can engage and get the results we're looking for.
Okay. All right. So yeah, just quickly, actually, can I just ask? I'm not too familiar how it works, whether abroad and how it should strictly apply here. But would you say it should only cover original works, or works that are also reproduced? In terms of maybe some sculptures now, for example, if I go off to I don't know, Germany and have a tutu remade for me.
Okay, so it covers original works.
Okay.
And the Berne Convention is clear on that. The Nigerian Corporate Act is clear on that. There's actually a reasoning behind it. Okay. Oliver mentioned when he was taking his speech, he said something. He made a distinction between other authors and creatives in how they get their remuneration. So for a music artist, for instance, his work can be reproduced easily, right? The value of his work is not diminished by the reproduction. Mm-hmm. But when you talk about visual arts, the originality of the work is intrinsic. The value of the work is intrinsic in its originality. So if you water that down, you are basically touching the nerve of that work, so to speak. And that's the reason why visual artists don't usually get revenue from reproduction and things like that. And again, this is the justification behind the resale rights, because whereas other authors would get, their royalties from the further sale of reproduced works, a visual artist doesn't have that opportunity because generally speaking, there is no reproduction, that has the same value as the original, which is why the law recognizes the resale rights. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, we'll take that. Thank you very much for that. I think I'll just ask 2 more questions and then, leave it open to the audience to engage as well. So for example, in the secondary market, again, I don't necessarily want to call it fraud per se, but I think we've touched on it in terms of reproduction. But in cases where Neil, for example, showed us that some people are out there producing works and making them seem like their original works or whatever. So in cases of fraud and misrepresentation, what sort of measures? I mean, we're going into the criminal side of things now, but what would you say we should be thinking about in terms of the resale rights? I mean, we're in the secondary market is quite big. I mean, fraud and misrepresentation is very, very prevalent in that on that side.
Well, most of these issues that we're talking about borders on the legality and the legal processes, protecting the artworks, protecting the artist, and, Copyright Commission and the government, infrastructure on ground protecting the rights of the artist is very vital. Like we, for instance, the National Gallery of Art, we have the, mandate to collect works. We are provided the resources to patronize and collect works for national collections. And any work in the national collection is under our custody. And for the work that is in the custody of the national collection, it is well protected, well registered, well documented. So there is no way piracy can penetrate it. Even if the artist that we patronize or that donated the work or we will acquire the work from request for the collection of the work, we have to go through the processes of the documentation and make sure that the right of the artist is not infringed. I think that, like he suggested, there is a need for us to work together, because I believe that this conference that is, going on now is very important to us, because I have a lot that I will take back home, because if artists should work so hard to deliver his creative work and he does not have any benefit that comes to him, even when the work is given out to a third party. That is the reason why a lot of works are flying all over places and the artists are not getting their due. But if the law that we are talking about, the bill that we are talking about, it is assented, we have provision to guide and monitor the movement of works, code them properly, and make sure that the rights of the artist and what is due for artists through resale or even reprint or any form of duplication gets to the artist or the world. You know, because as it is, like when we are doing documentation or reparation of works that have defects or any form of damage in our custody, we contact the artist, we get their consent and approval. And even if the artist is not alive, like Prof. Wong, we get to the world and get them to approve that this work, this is the condition of the work, this is how we should go about it. Because it is a government organization and it is given the power to do such, to carry out such regulations. It is because of lack of regulations that so many of the problems that we are talking about are existing. So we need to work together to put structures on ground to regulate the movement of the works properly.
So just finally, how do you think these royalties can enable proper cataloging and authentication of artists' works?
Royalty.
In any way?
Royalty, we have to work with the stakeholders because there is no, for us, we have no existing formula of valuing the work that we can categorize. This is how a particular work should be valued for royalty. But if a work is, if a record is kept properly, if a work is sold for any amount, a certain percentage as agreed by the stakeholders and documented properly and covered by the law, the estate will get their property.
All right. Okay, thank you very much. Do you want to add anything? Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean,
That's
yesterday
okay.
and this morning, we had a symposium on counterfeiting and piracy. And there we're talking about pharmaceuticals, talking about film, music, and books. Coming here this afternoon and hearing that there are fakes in the art world gets me really, really worried. I never thought that was the problem we're going to be facing here. So coming from Nigerian, I never thought it was, seeing those slides, I said, wow. So for the Nigerian Copyright Commission, I think we should work with SNA on this. Okay? We should have a reporting desk. You would know, I don't mind if someone copies a painting and puts his signature. Well, this guy's just, trying to be like me. But when he puts, when it becomes a counterfeit by you signing, if you sign Bruce now, or you sign Oshinowo, or you sign Benetton, when you are not, that's just unacceptable. And I think the NCC will be more than happy to make a few scapegoats out of this.
Fantastic.
So let there be a reporting mechanism. Let members know they can report. And let us have the report. Let us know the person. If he has to go to jail, so be it. It's just not acceptable. We have enough headache in film and music. And the earlier we nip this in the bud, the better. We can't allow this to go on. So for that, for the fakes, we have to clean up, the studios. And bring some sanity to bear in this area so the value of art can begin to rise like we've been told in the world art market.
Thank you very much. Well, I like the sound of this, penalizing fakes and perpetrators of all these ills. So artists, if you have anybody copying your works and all of that, please feel free to report them. Okay, so let's just open the floor for questions from the audience. Is there somebody to help pass a mic, please? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Nimo Jomadugu. I work with Professor Jogu and Jess Castiote at the Society for Art Collectors. I'm a lawyer, and we have actually been working on an article on resale rights of artists, so I'm really excited about this. And I have like 1,001 questions, but I will try to limit it. I think my question really is that while it is interesting to discuss all these possibilities of what the resale rights of artists could be. I think we really have, at this point, downplayed the problem that it is that there's no implementation, there's no regulation implementing it. It's almost kind of pointless to have a right you cannot act on. You can't go to court, you can't act on it. That's why we have the problem that, unfortunately, the tutu sold and the family didn't get any proceeds from it. But then moving past that, I think the issue now then becomes, even when we want to do it, how do we do it? Because we now have this benefit at this point that so many countries, I think in Africa alone, there are like 19 countries that have actually either had a bill or have existing resale rights. These countries have varying, the provisions are so different, although they all agree that the artists should have royalty rights. The provisions are varying, they're staggered to the extent that, okay, some countries, it's only a percentage, or you get only when there has been an increase in the price. So he asked the question previously that what happens when the value of the art falls? The question there now is, that's quite interesting. What happens when it falls? Would the person selling the rights, selling the artwork now suffer a loss? Some countries, I think Guinea-Bissau has now reached the point or not have implemented the law where the artist would only benefit when there's a profit, a substantial profit on that. So I think we have to discuss, if all these rights are implemented, if we now end up doing it, what now happens to the artist that is struggling to sell his work? Would he now have to live up to this expectation that he would probably have to sell at a much lower rate than he should? Because the artist, the buyer of the work, the art collector, would now be considering that in future he has to pay this person back whatever percentage it is. So we have to consider how many people are actually going to benefit from this. Yes, Tutu sold for 1.2, but there are artists that sell for like 100,000 naira. How many of these artists actually, what is even the retail, like we don't have the data to even work on it. What's the resale rate? How many artworks are resold in Nigeria? How many people will benefit from this? If they do, would they even suffer from it? So are you only benefiting those artists, if we implement it, those artists that already have a name for themselves, already have even the opportunity to sell their artwork? Or with the artists that, the lower ranking artists, sorry to use these terms, would they also benefit from this, or would it rather be at their own detriment? So not really a question. If you can answer that, that would be nice, but I just think is like there's so many questions, data-wise really, that we are lacking to even start working on it. Thank you.
Yeah, just to say that, I mean, I can understand. I'm also frustrated, believe me. But what Section 13.1 says is, notwithstanding any assignment or sale of the original work, the authors of graphic works, three-dimensional works, and manuscripts shall have an inalienable right to a share in the proceeds of any sale of that work or manuscript by public auction or through a dealer, whatever the method used by the latter to carry out the operation. So first, there's no way you can get the proceeds of a sale below value. So we're really talking about, where there's some profit. And really, I think it even applies more to the below the line artists. For instance, I know people who go to schools, like Yabatech, ABU, and they see students' works. And they know these works are very good. And they know the student just wants something. And they talk the student into collecting some, just have 10K and, let's go with this. And the student releases the work, not knowing the value of that work. Because, I don't know, I may be wrong, but the system does not always allow you have a place to go and check the value of your work. So if the student releases the work to that collector, and the student finds, maybe after 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line, that that work is worth way more than 10,000 naira. Believe me, for that student, it will be good to have this kind of provision work for him or her. So it's not just for the artists like the Benetton Woods of this world, but even for Benetton, if one understands the story, well, Oliver, you know it better, but when that work was painted, maybe it wasn't worth so much. It took a while to get the works out, and then the value came on. And I'm told that Someone will just go with that money, they share it, and nothing goes to the estate. That's what we're saying. So I think the provision is already there. It's better late than never. So the earlier we begin to, either we get it out of the act, and then we don't have that provision, or if we have the provision like we do, we should activate it and appear to be responsible to our laws. But I agree with you, we have to interrogate and come up with some workable solution in this area.
Absolutely. I hope that has touched on some of the points you raised. I mean, in terms of profits, majorly. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for reading.
My name is Bruce Onobrakweya. I want to correct the Copyright Council representative that the artists are not aware or have not actually fought for this resale right. Many years back, we actually led a delegation to Abuja to ask for the ratification of the resale right. And that is why it's even tabled for discussion. But my question now is, what can we do to fast pedal the process of this ratification? It is there. I know that sometimes before things are done, people have to carry placards. Are we saying that the artists should go to the street and cry out before this is ratified? Or, to put it in another way, what can we do to fast pedal the ratification of this copyright law? I mean, the ratification of, the resale right, so that the artist can benefit. Wong, Levi Wong was among the delegation that went to Abuja. The late Gbadamosi was also one of them. So we've been fighting, but no one, even from the Copyright Council or the NGA, has moved forward to help us. So my plea to the generality of the people in Nigeria, the art patrons, the collectors, please help us to get this law ratified. It's there. It's just that, like Shilon suggested, the artists have to come out and nominate someone to go to the Senate or the House of Assembly before they can get their own right. Should we do that? So I'm asking, I'm pleading, help us to get the ratification so that the artists can benefit and move forward. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'll have to stand up now because I'm still an African. Professor Bruce Onobrakwe cannot be begging me, and I will sit down here and pretend that I'm just a director general. No, it's not about that. Prof, if between, well, not even you don't have to do anything, please. You've paid your dues. We should now begin to run errands for you. It's possible that you went and knocked on the wrong doors in Abuja. The delegation did not come to Nigerian Copyright Commission to say this is a proposal. If SNA can come up tonight with a draft of what they want in activating Section 13, I promise you by Monday next week, I will take the draft and get ministerial approval for the regulation. It's not rocket science. It's not like going to the moon. It's a very simple process. It's by way of a regulation to activate that provision. And for that to happen, all we need is the approval of the minister approving the regulation. We put it in the Gazette. It becomes a regulation. So I promise you, anytime the stakeholders are ready and they agree to what they consider to be a workable regulatory framework, believe me, within 2 weeks or within a week, that draft will proceed to the minister. And I can assure you that you'll get the approval from the minister for us to go on and gazette it. So, sir, please, you are sending me on that errand. And I promise you that the commission will deliver as soon as we get the mandate from the stakeholders. So please, sir, don't beg us. Don't beg us. We are to run errands for you. Thank you very much, sir.
All right, thank you so much. SNA president and members, please take note.
I was going to share my experience. Some 23 years ago, 1985 was when I saw a copy of the copyright law of Nigeria. And I took interest in it, and I read through it. All these things we are talking about, I embedded, in that copyright decree. Yes, I saw it there, even the percentages and so on, and that the artist will collect something after he had died, maybe 7 years or so. I read it and I put it away. I didn't know that the following year my right would be violated because somebody just called my attention to the fact that my work had been reproduced by a company. And I called their attention to the fact that I was not informed at all about the usage of my work. And there was no response. There was no reply. The first letter, second letter, third letter. I got a vibrant young lawyer who was firebrand at the time. But the important thing is that I won the case, and it's been a celebrated case that is made references to. And the judge gave a hint that the case actually enabled her to study the copyright decree.
One here, actually. Just very quickly, please. Let's just take the questions and then we can answer after. Thank you.
Thank you. My question goes around what I'll call our forgetfulness of the fact that when a work cures and matures, it is actually the artist's personality that lends credence to that value that gets into the work. So if an artist's personality and value and aging gives value to his or her work, as we've seen in so many instances, it then becomes imperative that a resale right must get back to that artist because it's the artist's persona that gives value to old works that are resold as much as they do.
Okay, that's an interesting one as well. It's one of the issues to obviously consider. I would imagine the artist is also doing better works as well, rather than just their personality.
Thank you.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Mine is not a question. It's actually an observation.
Okay.
Don't you think this Resale Act is going to actually encourage the black market for the arts? Now, I want to buy a work from a gallery, and I have to pay VAT. I have to pay a commission to the gallery. And at the same time, I'm thinking, okay, now there's a Resale Act. There's a commission that goes to the artist. I am not disputing the fact that this is a noble cause. I buy into it. I love it. But I think we need to take a critical look at this. It's going to encourage the black market. Because if I'm going to sell a work, or I want to buy, I'd rather buy directly from someone who's doing a private sale, rather than taking it into an auction or taking it into the gallery to sell, and then have to pay VAT, have to pay gallery commission, have to pay auction commissions, and on top, I have to pay the Resale Act bill, whatever. So I think we should critically look at this. It's noble for me. It's something I want to, I buy into it. But let's take a good look at this. Thank you.
That's it. No more questions, please, after. No, please go ahead. Please go ahead with your question.
Good evening. My name is Aduke Gomez. I think that in terms of the discussions here, I think that we need to really pay attention to the fact that copyright is a really technical issue, okay? For artists whose work, in fact, is in prints, each print is regarded as an original. So therefore, when we talk about only one copy, only one work being the work in which the copyright is, it may be a bit technical to talk about. And there are several issues around it, even with sculpture, when you have like the mold and you now are making many and you have now done it, you've numbered it from 1 to 50. Each of the 50 are in fact an original. So I think these are the kind of issues that I think that before the SNA rushes into a communicate this evening to the DJ, I'd like to ask that perhaps the DJ gives his expert opinion first before a final draft is given, because so that a lot of things don't fall by the wayside. Thank you.
Okay. I know I did say one more question, but I said no more question, but just one more for. It's not a question, ma. Okay, just contribution. Okay. So quickly, and then we end it, please. If you have any more questions specifically for any of the panelists, please, after we round up. Thank you.
In my 54 years of collecting art, I've only sold 3 times. That's in 54 years. That's not much. And it's going to be really probably lockup of not selling. Simply because the artwork, I believe, matures even more when it's not seen too much. It's seen quite a bit, but not too much, because overexposure also leads to downgrading of the work. Are you following me? So it means a collector is not poor, cannot afford to be poor if you really are a true collector. You buy, you keep it. And you find that artists don't like to sell to you if they feel you're going to buy it on Sunday and you're going to flip it on Monday. They won't sell to you. But when they know it's in a collection that is known but not entirely seen, and they're not going to see their work in 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 years being sold, they will sell to you. And I think I'm right. Some of the artists too are here. All right.
Thank you very much, Professor. And at this stage, we say thank you very much to everybody for attending. Thank you to my panelists for doing some sort of justice to the topic. We really appreciate it. So, yes.
When an artist produced an artwork, sometimes that work can leave the artist's hand in a way that the artist does not even benefit much from it. The artist might be very hungry, and then he'll give it away for nothing. But eventually, if that work appreciates, then that is the time that he gets the value from that work. So it's even necessary that, a resale, going back to the artist, would even help the artist grow. Because You don't stop working as an artist. You keep working and working and working. And there's a time you don't have enough money to work anymore.